natives has devalued them, especially in our country. This goes back to colonization, where colonists fetishized native women because they were exotic and more sexually accessible than European women. The remnants of that mindset are still alive today. One example where you could see it is in Minnesota and the Dakotas. Oil workers live in man camps. And in these man camps, there is a high rate of drug use, gambling, and sex trafficking, especially of Native women. There's so much injustice that is happening against Native American communities, and still their cultures are thriving. But they should not have so much to struggle against, because do any of us really have so much pressure from so many different places on us? Another group is immigrants. Immigrants who come to America have to work through a labyrinth of challenges. They are fleeing threats and are met with new ones at our borders. The New York Times found hundreds of cases of harrowing sexual assault against migrants, especially migrant women. Many of these attacks go unreported, though. Smugglers and gangs hold women and children hostage for days. They rape them, they instill fear in them, and establish a power dominance that they can use to squeeze more money out of these migrants. Sometimes these migrants are forced into prostitution on either side of the United States border. Exploitation of this sort is a threat for any refugee fleeing anywhere because they lack protection, they lack security, especially if they do not have the proper documentation and are afraid to ask authorities for help. A lot of the time, we see that smugglers and traffickers will confiscate the documentation of migrants in order to exert more control over them. And when you have less documentation, you are more vulnerable to human trafficking. It's easier to just wipe you away from the population and pretend that you don't exist. This is why, for example, in San Diego County, 31% of undocumented Spanish-speaking migrant workers experience labor trafficking. I watched a presentation by A. Zhenpu, who works with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She told the story of a girl named Lily from Jamaica. Lily needed to support her family, and she was looking for a job in America. An American family offered her work as a nanny, and they told her that she would have access to a U.S. education, and a weekly salary would be sent home to her family. And so Lily came here to work and helped raise this family's 3 children. But she was not allowed to contact her family at all while she was here. She did not go to school, and she did not get paid for 15 years. She was a slave in an American family's home. Eventually, Lily did get help from A. Zhenpu and escaped from enslavement here. But there are upwards of 20 to 30,000 people who are trafficked into the United States every year. They're trafficked into homes, into businesses, and communities all around us. It can be very difficult for people trafficked from abroad to ask for help. They're in an unfamiliar country. We have unfamiliar laws, and perhaps also an unfamiliar language. And their identification papers, like I mentioned before, could have been confiscated by their traffickers and used as leverage to control them. There's also a sentiment of hostility towards immigrants here in America. So, in this situation, how likely would you be to ask for help? And would you even know where you could turn to? Think about yourself or your own children traveling abroad. You would be in somewhat of the same situation as an immigrant in America, with a different language, different culture, different laws. You as well would be vulnerable to human trafficking, but you have the ability to come home to a safe place, and they don't necessarily have that. Another group that is disproportionately affected are members of the LGBT community. People who are part of the LGBT community, especially young people, are at a heightened risk of sex trafficking. Harassment from the communities around them, bullying at school, and eventually perhaps rejection by their own families pushes many of them onto the streets. Up to 40% of homeless young people identify as LGBT, and almost 60% of those homeless LGBT young people are victims of sexual abuse. They are much more likely to engage in commercial sex to meet their basic needs, because they don't necessarily have a home, have a job, they don't have food, and they need a quick way to make money. And if you're a trafficker, that's exactly what you're looking for. And this should be a grave concern to you, because whether or not you support people of this community, many kids in Three Village identify as LGBT. And so many of them could be vulnerable to human trafficking. Lastly, there are African Americans. Throughout our history, African Americans have struggled to get protection for their rights, to get access to the resources that many white people have gotten without even trying. And they continue to face obstacles today. For this reason, more than half of all confirmed victims of sex trafficking are African Americans. More than half of them, according to the U.S. Justice Department. Yet, African Americans are only 13% of the population. So how is this happening? Not only is sex trafficking a problem that is often hard to see, but if you are black and trafficked, you are virtually invisible. Cyntoia Brown exemplifies not only the effects of these vulnerabilities because she is a person of color, because she is a femme, she has a feminine gender identity, and she was in foster care, but she also shows us that the judicial system in our country a lot of times is failing the people that it's supposed to serve, turning to incarceration rather than rehabilitation. Cyntoia Brown entered the Tennessee foster care system after her mother, who abused drugs and alcohol, gave her up for adoption. As an impulsive teenager who was dealing with a lot of stresses, she ran away from her home when she was a young teen, and she became homeless on the street. She had nowhere to go, and she was vulnerable. She started living in a hotel with a pimp, and he would verbally and physically beat her. He would rape her, and eventually he forced her into prostitution. In 2004, her pimp sent her out to make money, and Cyntoia was picked up by a man who paid her for sex. She was on her last legs, and she feared that this man was violent. She needed to escape, and so she shot and killed him and ran away. Soon afterwards, Cyntoia was caught and she was arrested. She was charged as an adult for homicide, and she was sentenced to 51 years in prison. She was only 16 years old at the time. So far, Cyntoia has spent 15 of her years in prison. In that time, she has transformed herself. She mentored young people who were in difficult situations like she was. She earned a high school diploma, and she earned an associate's degree from Lipscomb University, graduating with a 4.0 GPA. She said that she wanted to live the rest of her life helping others, especially young people. And her hope is to make sure that young girls like herself avoid ending up in the places that she was. Thankfully, last year she was granted clemency, and she was finally released from prison this past August. And thankfully, policies have changed. If Cyntoia Brown was tried today, she would have been treated as a child sex trafficking victim and not as a criminal. But many human trafficking victims remain in jail, and many continue to be represented in the media as criminals rather than victims, because they do not necessarily say that they're a victim. Sometimes they believe it's safer for themselves and for their families to remain silent or assume responsibility for prostitution charges. For this reason, it's better to call the human trafficking hotline if you suspect that someone is involved in human trafficking, or if you suspect that a business is involved in human trafficking, because the human trafficking hotline can connect the victims with resources not only to get out of their situation, but also to build up their life and their stability so that they don't fall back into human trafficking. So, what do we do with this knowledge? We know that human trafficking is a horrific economy of manipulation that terrorizes and damages its victims. But we do not even see the victims because they are hidden away. And that is a critical problem, because when we don't see them or hear them? How do we see the problem? And how do we make the problem worth solving? Human trafficking is not more prevalent in indigenous communities, in LGBT communities, because of anything they're doing wrong. There's instead something wrong with the people that we value and protect, and the people that we provide resources to. Our country is based on the values of liberty and equality and justice. But at the same time, it has taken so much from its own citizens. And our government is not protecting them to the extent that they should. We as citizens are not protecting each other as much as we should. The evidence of this is anywhere that you look. Communities of color are often poorer, often they have less power politically. A lot of times they have underfunded schools and lack access to health care and fresh, affordable food that is nutritious or clean water. Native American communities are among the most impoverished. They rely on government-provided health care, and they continue to struggle on land that was stolen from them and stripped of its resources. Money equals power, and this is being restricted from these groups of people. Their bodies are being controlled to take power from them. Poverty in conjunction with less access to education and job opportunities makes them more vulnerable to so many ills, and human trafficking is only one of them. This is not by accident. Certain groups are covertly targeted, and over time they have been disadvantaged in our nation's history. We are saying to them that you are not worth the care that it takes to sustain you and to help you thrive. If these groups continue to be vulnerable, we are all also vulnerable. We are all from different walks of life. We are all on different socioeconomic levels, and poverty is not that far away from our community. We could all fall into economic hardship, and our children could all be targeted for human trafficking. We call ourselves a developed nation, but so many people are not given the opportunity to develop themselves like I have been able to do. So many people's rights to the resources that they need to survive and thrive are not being protected. Right now, people are struggling. So are we really so different from less developed countries that are marred by instability and exploitation? When we look out into the world, we are looking into a mirror. Some people are valued more than others. Some people, like me, like you, are allowed to thrive, and some people are not. So, what are we going to do about it? I know that I did not have to be born as a person who is valued in this country because of my economic potential, because of my race, because of my sexual orientation, or my gender identity. I did not have to be born in a thriving town and a wonderful school district like Three Village. But I was. And I myself am now facing the question of how I have to yield my power so that others can have access to the wonderful things that I have had access to. These are all complicated issues, but there is hope when we don't let the victims continue to suffer in silence, when we don't let them remain voiceless. There is hope as long as we care enough to do something. So for that reason, I made a resource for you, a very preliminary sort of step. And you can find on the table over there are pamphlets where I listed some important facts and organizations that you can support and ways that you can start becoming more knowledgeable about human trafficking and other issues, because a lot of them are interconnected. So one important thing you can do in terms of human trafficking is to know the signs so that when you see it, you can report to the hotline. Another thing is to research before you buy things. The cheap goods and clothes and makeup that we have access to